All right, guys, back with Adam Hayes, part two of our three-part series. They're going to be a little bit shorter parts in our normal hour, but getting into some really detailed stuff about specific things. And this one is going to be all about the moon. You hear a lot of guys say they think the moon has a lot to do with whitetail movement, and you hear other guys say it has nothing to do with it. A little backstory. Adam and I purchased the MoonGuide from Jeff Murray, or Jeff Murray's wife. How long ago was that, Adam? 10 years ago?
Yeah.
At least 10 years ago. Kind of resurrected that thing, and he and I both followed the MoonGuide long before we purchased it and resurrected it. And then Adam has it all to himself now and has done an incredible job with it, actually helping people kill deer.
Trying to, man.
It actually helping people kill deer. So Adam, tell us a little bit about the MoonGuide. And I know you get these questions all the time, but what the red moon is and how the MoonGuide works, and how, just give us a little history. You've done this spiel a million times, but I want guys to hear it, and then I'm gonna be kind of the devil's advocate here and get into some of the naysayers and those type things, and you can kind of explain how that's wrong and that sort of stuff. So fire away.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing really to say is that the MoonGuide is not based on the phase of the moon, and lost track of how many times I hear guys talk about the phase and they think it's all about the phase of the moon. It's really got nothing to do with that. The MoonGuide is based on the gravitational pull of the moon. In the moon's rotation around the earth every day, there's actually 2 times every day where the moon is closer to the earth than any other time, and that's your overhead and underfoot moon, when it's either straight up or straight down. And as it rotates around the earth at those 2 times that it's the closest, your overhead and underfoot moon, that's when you have the most gravitational pull on the earth from the moon. It's what triggers the tides to come in and out. I mean, it's that strong that it moves the largest mass on our planet, the tide, the oceans. The key to the MoonGuide is, there's only a handful of days every month when those peak times, that peak gravitational pull, lines up with prime time for deer movement in the morning and the evening. So that's going to be your red moon days, your best days to catch deer moving during daylight, especially mature deer moving just a little bit earlier than they normally would. Because if you think about it, a mature buck most of the time is going to lay there in his bed until it gets dark and then move during season, because they've learned, after 4, 5, 6 seasons, that's the safest thing to do. But when you've got that gravitational pull of the moon, it's an instinctive deal that's just giving them that little extra nudge to get up and move right at that time when they normally want to anyway. It's normally like the icing on the cake to get a big buck up and moving, when any other time you're just going to lay there a few extra minutes until it gets dark and when it's safe. So that's really the MoonGuide in a nutshell, based on the position of the moon in the sky. It's not about the phase of the moon. It's about that position of the sky that has the strongest gravitational pull, and then lining that up during prime time when deer want to move anyway.
So the red moon are the days when the overhead moon is at prime time.
Overhead or underfoot.
Overhead or underfoot.
Yeah.
That on the MoonGuide, or when people hear you talk about, hey, there's a red moon day coming, that means 8:00 in the morning, 4:00 in the afternoon, there is an overhead or underfoot moon during that time.
Yeah, and you're going to get a window, of about 4 or 5 days where it's going to be, within, a couple hours either side of sunrise or sunset. So it's not just one specific day. And, at the very end of it, you've got a moon that peaks just after, dark. And guys sometimes have asked, why does the moon guide say the best time is, 45 minutes after dark? Well, that's not necessarily the best time, but it kind of falls in that window, that it's still affecting those animals to move before it gets dark.
Right.
Because it's happening close to that time.
They're
So
feeling that gravitational pull.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you hear a lot of people. I was driving down the road. I drive by this field every day, and all of a sudden there's 18 deer out of it in the afternoon. And what the heck? It's the same stuff planted there. They're completely relaxed. What the heck is going on? Why are they there that day and not, why weren't they there 5 days earlier than that?
Yeah. Yeah. And you can see it with, farm animals too. Those two peak activity times during that overhead or underfoot moon, they're an hour later each day. So you get a handful of days where they're close to sunrise or sunset. You'll have a handful of days where it's peaking in the middle of the day, and that's typically when, somebody's driving down the road, there's deer out everywhere. It's the middle of the day. What's going on? Well, normally if you got access to that information and you can look at it, it's because that moon is peaking in the middle of the day.
Yeah. No, that's for sure. But, you hear a lot of guys say, oh, I don't believe in the moon guide. I'm going to hunt only when it's cold or colder than the average temperature. Weather obviously plays a huge part in it. And then they'll cite, well, all these QDMA studies or Mississippi State University studies show that the moon has zero impact on deer. Anybody that has got a computer and can go to Google moon and research, and all those reports and studies are going to come up. What do you say to that?
Well, the first thing I'd say is, I'm not here to say that nothing's as important as the moon. I've said it numerous times. I think there's three main factors to deer movement, three main factors that influence or increase, deer activity, and that's the wind, the weather, and the moon now, and not necessarily in that order. You're gonna be hard pressed to find any hunter that's gonna argue the fact about the weather influencing activity. Everybody believes the weather influences activity, including myself. There's weather patterns that are going to increase activity. There's weather patterns that are going to decrease activity, but the weather's not 100%. I can't tell you how many days in the last 43 seasons where I've been out and the weather was perfect and didn't see a deer. You can't count on the weather 100%. You can't count on the moon 100%. I really believe it's all about lining up, the wind that's great for the animal that you're hunting, going in on the red moon when the moon is in your favor as well. And if you can get a good weather pattern on top of that, it's just the icing on the cake. I think that's the perfect storm for whitetail hunting. But I've seen, a few of the, more than one of the big deer that I've killed, I killed them with a good wind, a good moon, and the weather was, really hot.
The last 200 you killed in Kansas. It was hot.
It was almost 80 degrees out. There was no reason for that deer to be up moving 2 hours before dark.
And that was in October, right?
No, that was the first week of November.
Oh, it was the first week. I thought it was the end of October.
First week of November it was, but just like it seemed like always in Kansas, it was just extremely hot, when it shouldn't have been. But yeah, it's all about lining up multiple factors that are going to increase activity. But like I said, the moon's not 100%, the weather's not 100%, but something that guys need to think about. Not everybody gets to hunt as much as I do or you do, and they might only have 1 week to hunt or, a couple weeks vacation. And, the moon is really the only thing that you can predict months or even years in advance, So if you're going to spend 1 week, your only week of vacation, for a guided hunt or going out of state to hunt somewhere, why wouldn't you look at that and consider that? It's all about stacking the deck in your favor. So you want to really do everything you can to increase your chances. And, the moon's just a part of Mother Nature, just like the weather is, but you can't predict what the weather's going to be doing the third week of November, for this fall, but what the moon's going to be doing.
Right.
So it really helps when it comes to planning. But I understand what you're saying about the moon. There's a lot of guys out there that think it's nonsense. There's a lot of guys that have looked at it and learned about how it affects deer and have seen the proof in the pudding that it works. When it comes to these studies, I've read all the studies. I just honestly don't think there's one single study out there, at least that I've read, that really looks at what matters to me. And the three things that matter to me are: is this study done with all the deer in a herd? Is it done with all the bucks in a herd? Because we're not talking about all those deer. We're talking about the top 1, 2, maybe 3%, the most mature animal in a herd. And everybody knows that that animal is different than the rest of the animals in the herd. Yep. So until somebody does a study on just mature bucks, they're not going to get my attention, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about trying to kill that top 2%, the oldest animal in that herd. And it's just not the same animal as the rest of the deer. So these studies that are done for, on an entire group of deer, does, immature bucks, fawns, mature bucks, it's just, you're just not comparing apples to apples. The second thing that I would say about that is this study, until you can get a study that's actually focused on that specific time of the year when we're trying to kill them, say late September through October, maybe even November, because a big mature buck is not going to be acting the same in the third week of October that he does in the middle of summer.
Yeah.
He's a different deer than the rest of the herd, and he does not act the same way the entire year. You got a really small window when I want to know, what these deer are doing and when they're moving. So you're talking about a very small percentage of the herd. You're talking about a very small window, not, something that's observed throughout the whole year. And then, we're not talking about this huge migration, movement pattern. We're talking about a specific buck getting up just a few minutes early. And, in October, he's moving maybe less than 100 yards from his bed where he's feeding. So it's not a great big pattern that I'm going to think you're going to see this great big movement arc in a study. We're really breaking it down to, a very small part of the herd. We're talking about a very small movement. We're talking about, a few minutes early compared to, coming out after shooting light. And I've not seen a study that's that specific,
Yeah. And a lot of them that I have seen, and I'm sure somebody's going to point this out to our attention, has been moon phase, right?
Yeah, that's another thing.
It's all,
all about moon phases.
It's phase. Y'all say the moon has nothing to do with it. This moon phase chart, the study shows that when it's a quarter full moon, it has no difference on the deer movement, whatever it may be. We've talked about it a million times. It's not the phase, it's the position. So a lot of the studies I have seen are going to say are all about the phase.
I've conducted my own study, for the last 25 years with this stuff, and I'll compare my wall in my den to anybody else's, when it comes to killing mature deer. And I'm not trying to brag, but I mean, if you want, let's say you want to catch your first 50-inch muskie, okay? Are you going to go by a study that you read in a book somewhere about, the movements of muskie? Or are you going to go talk to 5 or 6 guys that have been catching 50-inch muskies for 20 years?
100%. And let me reiterate, before you and I got the MoonGuide, we were hunting with the MoonGuide.
Yeah.
This is not some sales pitch, after the fact. I mean, if people go back and look at the old Whitetails Addictions, you and Andre, y'all had the MoonGuide. Y'all talked about the MoonGuide. You can find those things online. And that was long before you and I bought the MoonGuide. And Andre was not sponsored. Whitetail Addictions was not sponsored by the MoonGuide.
Yeah. The only reason we bought it, the only reason it came available because Jeff Murray, who came out with it in the late 90s, which I've been following it since the late 90s, had leukemia. He wasn't able to, keep up with the work with the MoonGuide for the last 5, 6, 7 years of his life. He was really sick, and Jeff's last hunt was here in Ohio with me, and he died the following February. And that was the reason we were able to purchase this, because I talked to Jeff. His family called me when Jeff couldn't even talk anymore and said, he wanted me to have the first opportunity because I'd gotten to know Jeff. Jeff, taught me everything he knew about the moon. I read his books back then. I was talking to him on the phone almost nightly, the year I killed my first 200, because I was skeptical about it, but he kept preaching it to me and talking about the red moon and, lining everything up and staying out there and stacking the deck in your favor. Went in and killed my first 200-inch deer. And I mean, it's been a staple in what I've done for over 20 years now. And that's the reason that we even thought about it, is because I knew Jeff, knew the work, had seen it work, and it was going away. We've just been able, fortunately, to purchase that from his family, keep it going. And really, at the end of the day, it's just been about keeping that around so that it could help other guys enjoy the same amount of success that we've had with big deer. And that's really what it's all about. Just helping fellow hunters be more successful. If we've learned anything since we bought it, it's that there's an educational process and a learning curve to this whole moon thing. And that I think everybody out there thinks, yeah, the moon might have something to do with deer activity, but until they really understand, how the moon works, how this gravitational pull works, why the MoonGuide works the way it does, and how it all ties together, it's a little bit of, there's a little bit of an educational process to it.
It's funny. I'm gonna throw another story out there. If you remember, I don't know if you were in the meeting or maybe on the phone, or it was just me and Jeff, but my partner in Osseo right now, he helped us with the first year of marketing the MoonGuide when we bought it, or I guess really the second year. The first year we weren't going to do anything, but the second year, and I went in and explained everything to him, and he said, "This is an educational product. You've got to educate people. If you're going to play baseball, everybody knows that you've got to have a baseball glove. You've got to, so Mizuno, Rawlings, Under Armour, I don't even know if Under Armour makes baseball, but Mizuno and Rawlings, you've got to convince them that that's the best baseball glove for you to buy. They need to buy a Rawlings. So that's how you would market that, is you've got to convince people, because everybody already knows you got to have a glove. With the MoonGuide, not everybody needs that to whitetail hunt. So you've got to educate people as to why the moon can help them. So that it was just a different process. And, something that is outside. If you're going to bow hunt, you've got to have a bow. Matthews has got to convince people that Matthews, or we should say Hoyt, shouldn't we, since we're Team 200 here? Hoyt has got to convince people they got to buy Hoyt. So, and the MoonGuide, you've got, it's an educational process. And there's really, you see a lot of these other, like peak movement times and peak activity times, and it's based on a whole bunch of other things. But the MoonGuide is one in itself. It's its own thing that's been around for a long time, with a ton of big deer to back up what it says.
And it's not just hunting. I mean, we're talking about a force that you can't see that's strong enough to move the oceans.
Yeah.
Fishermen have followed the moon for probably longer than guys in the hunting industry have. You talk to any musky fisherman that's worth his salt, they follow the moon. I forget who it was recently told me that over half of the records in the IGFA, which is kind of like Boone and Crockett for the fishing industry, record keeping, over half of the trophies in the IFGA or IGFA were related to some kind of lunar occurrence. So I
And
mean,
muskie's a freshwater fish.
yeah,
So that has nothing to do with tides. You
nope.
could argue, okay, the biggest redfish are killed, when the tide's coming in because that's when they're feeding. But a muskie has nothing to do. It's fresh water. There is no tide. So what's making him want to feed them?
Yeah.
That overhead moon is triggering him to want to feed them. So it's pretty fascinating stuff. The way I have always looked at it, if you are skeptical, which I'm obviously not skeptical, but if you are skeptical, somebody that's listening, you're talking about it's $19. Is that what it is? The app, or 20? How much is it?
It depends if you get the dial or the app, but yeah, I mean, it's the least expensive product you're going to buy all year, and probably the most valuable information you could have.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
A $20 purchase or 25, whatever it is, and you have an app, you have, or you get the data wheel, and it's worth going back and looking at daylight trail camera pictures and spinning the wheel, or we've done thousands of those,
Yeah.
thousands and thousands.
And I tell you, if a guy is still skeptical about it, we created a free version of the MoonGuide, so you can download the app and look at all the historical data. And that's really when people have their light bulb moment. When they look at historical data, they compare when they've killed their big deer or when they finally got that daylight picture of a big buck they've been chasing for forever and a day, and compare those pictures and those kill dates with the red moon. That's the light bulb moment when guys like, man, there's something to this, because 9 times out of 10, their big deer that they've killed or finally got a daylight picture of that big buck lines up on the red moon. And man, when guys see that, it's a light bulb moment for a lot of guys.
All right, walk us through what you've got coming. Tell us about the app. So guys that don't know, that aren't familiar, the original MoonGuide was a data wheel that you would spin, and you would turn it to the day. Like if you wanted to see what was going to be going on in November of this coming hunting season, you would spin it to November 5th, or you could go all the way through, and it would tell you the days of the red moons and the best hunt times.
Yeah.
That's still available, correct?
Yep, the dial's still available. It only gives you 6 months of information, August through January. And then the way the app works is you can get not only 12 months of information, but it's zip code specific. So you can punch in your favorite locations, hunting locations, with the zip code and get, more accurate information by zip code. Because when we did the dial, we had to go by the central point in the United States. It's Columbia, Missouri, actually, is the geographical, center or midline in the United States. So everything's based on that area. So you've got to adjust the dial, if you're in a different time zone. But I mean, the red moon days are still the same.
Tell us, Adam, about we talked about this, I think, a couple weeks ago. You're maybe redoing the book, or going to put the book back out there, and then I hope that wasn't a secret. And you're tell us about the app, because there's more than just the moon information on your app, right? You're getting more value than just that.
Yep. So as far as the book goes, Jeff Root wrote the book Moonstruck back in the day, and I still go back and read some of it. I was just reading part of it the other day. One of the best publications ever on not just understanding the moon and the moon's influence on deer, but some great tactics in there that have been staples in my whole deal for over 20 years. Some great stuff in there by Miles Keller and some other people. But just, if you haven't read it, it's a really good read. It's been available in an ebook, but we're reprinting the book this year because a lot of guys have been asking for it forever and a day. And then I'm just about finished with Moonstruck Volume 2, kind of some more advanced tactics and stuff that I've done over the years, and some stuff related to the moon as well. So that's all going to be available here this year. And then as far as the app goes, we've got all the MoonGuide data, which I said, you can go back as far as you want historically if you want to compare dates and times to your deer that you've killed or pictures that you've gotten historically. You can see all this year's information, all 12 months, and it actually goes into next year as well, because at the end of the year, guys want to be able to plan their vacation. So you can see all that information. We're upgrading the mapping this year to Google Maps, so have about the most up-to-date, accurate mapping available. There's a bunch of great discounts on some great products like Osseo gear.
Oh yeah, I love it.
We actually had our first annual MoonGuide Big Buck contest this past year, where we gave away over $20,000 in cash and prizes for our Big Buck contest, and had some giant deer killed. I think there was, there was two of the four categories. The bucks that won were over 200 inches.
Wow.
So, yep, some really, really cool stuff in the app.
So in the app on the mapping feature, I mean, that's something where you can put waypoints in and that sort of stuff.
Yeah. It's not a mapping app per se, but I mean, anything that you want to do, if you want to look up landowner information, parcel lines, if you want to map out your food plots, see how big of an area you got to, plant or buy seed for, if you want to mark trails, rubs, I mean, you can do, just about anything you really need to do as far as, plotting, stuff on the maps. So yeah, it's not a mapping app, but it's got everything a guy would need for mapping.
And then weather, don't you have some weather features in there?
Yeah, there is weather. There's some really good weather information. It's just as good as, any other weather app out there. So
wind direction, barometric pressure, the whole front,
extended forecast, mapping, satellite radar. It's got everything you need. I mean, that was kind of the goal, was to have everything that I personally wanted in an app, so I'm not going to a different app for my mapping, going to a different app for weather. Everything that a guy needs is really all there.
All right, guys, part 3 with Adam Hayes. This is unfortunately going to have to be a short one. Hayes has got to go pick up his truck. So if y'all get mad about it being a 35-minute episode, you know who to get mad at. All right, so for this episode, we kind of teed it up on the last one. We're going to get Adam to walk us through some of his challenging hunts and what he did, how he put the puzzle together. You guys, you don't want to hear me talk. We got Adam on right now. So Adam, take it away. I think you were going to start with the buck you killed this year while it's fresh in your mind. Kind of take us on that journey, if you will.
Yeah, it was, like I said earlier, I think in part 1, man, this past season was probably one of my toughest seasons ever. Just couldn't catch a break with anything, strategic nightmare, just nothing was going right. It was on had big plans for Ohio, Kansas, and Illinois. I was on a giant deer in Illinois, 180 plus 190 inch 8-point with a big drop. I mean, just an amazing looking animal. Passed that deer up numerous times last year because I could tell he had a bunch of potential and was really young, and he made a huge jump last summer. We had a ton of trail camera pictures and video of that buck coming into the plot, just clockwork. And plan was to be over there for the opener. And I was over there for the opener and actually had that deer come out just after camera light, first week of season. And he was in range, 50 yards, but just no camera light. I just shut the camera off. So let him walk, and hunted hard for that week and never crossed paths with him again. And that deer just absolutely vanished. We know all the neighbors over there. We would have known if somebody hit that deer. I backed out and went way out of my way that night after dark to make sure I didn't bump him, and we just have no clue what happened to that buck. And, I've been waiting to get a crack at that deer all year and wasn't sure, what I was going to do. things kind of fell through in Kansas on the deer that I was after back there. Deer I was after here at home ended up getting poached that I found out about. And, I really, end of October, I was not sure what I was going to be doing, and was over in Illinois running cameras before I left, and happened to check a farm on my way out of town, and got a picture of a buck that I knew of. He'd been in the area for a couple of years, I think 3 years actually, that we knew of, because we had a shed off that buck and a lot of trail camera pictures. And it was a buck that just showed up very, very rarely. We knew he wasn't living on the farm. Had a general idea where he was coming from. Actually 2 farms over. And I think the issue was, he had to cross the farm next to us, obviously, to get to us. And there was a lot of tree stands between me and where the deer was coming from. Because like I said, we're surrounded by outfitters and a lot of out-of-state guys, and, guys, neighboring farm knew about that deer. So, I mean, that deer just was hardly ever getting to us in the light of day. And I pretty much wrote him off, but he showed up right on the red moon, of all things, actually. There at the mid-October. We ended up getting, I think, 1 daylight picture of him during the red moon in October. Big deer. I wasn't sure exactly how big, but he was big enough that kind of changed gears and was going to focus on that deer specifically. Spent a lot of the rut in November over there. Never laid eyes on him. We got 1 daylight picture in November, right on the red moon again, and starting thinking in the back of my head, this might be, a pattern developing with this deer. He disappeared again, pretty much all of December. We'd catch, get pictures of him occasionally, but I mean, they got 2 different gun seasons over there in Illinois during December. And just nothing going on in December. But towards the end of December and into January, he was starting to show up a little more consistently, but everything was still, at night. And I was just kind of thinking in the back of my head, if this buck's going to show back up, I'm betting that it's going to be on the last red moon of the season, which was the 2nd week of January. And I knew a lot of things had to happen. Like I said, he wasn't living on the farm. He'd show up once in daylight and be gone for 30 days. So it was kind of a shot in the dark. But, we had a little bit of inventory, kind of had a direction, line of travel where he was coming from. I knew what wind I needed to be blowing back in that direction where he was coming from, which was a northwest wind. Like I said, we had a red moon coming up. That 2nd week of January, which was the last week of season in Illinois. And I had planned on being at the archery trade show that week, and actually skipped it to go over there to hunt this deer.
Yeah, you were supposed to meet me there. I remember. Yeah.
You know how you rank.
Yeah, below a 180. I hope I always will.
So, yeah, I wanted to go over a little earlier. I didn't want to put it off till, the last 2 or 3 days of season, but the weather just wasn't cooperating. I think we had a bunch of thunderstorms that week, rain, just, wild weather for January. And I wasn't getting that northwest wind, until the end of the week, which, late season is kind of like early season in the fact that they're on a strict feeding pattern, and you're probably going to get 1 crack, and then that's amplified late season because they've been hunted for 3 or 4 months, and you're not going to get away with making any mistakes late season. You're going to get 1 crack, and that's it. And the thing I had in the back of my mind was, going into this farm, The problem was going to be getting out. If I didn't kill him, getting out of there without spooking all the deer and possibly even him and never getting another crack at him. So I really wanted to stack the deck in my favor and make sure when I went in, I had the best wind, I had the red moon, I had a good weather pattern. And really, I had to make sure that I got it done the first time that I went in. And that was going to be 13th of January with 2 days of season left. I think most guys probably would have made a mistake and gone in there a little bit earlier than that, running out of time, and kind of panicking, I got to get it done. I've only got a few days left of season, but I waited until the end of the week when I had the wind was the big thing. I wanted that wind blowing right back into where that buck was coming from because, that deer had been notorious for not showing up until after dark. So I wanted to make sure the wind was blowing right back in there to where he was coming from, and actually kind of put me in an awkward position because none of my stands were really set up to be able to kill him with that wind. I mean, he would have picked me off in the stands that I had set up, but fortunately we'd put a Banks blind in there on that food plot just for that scenario, which I've done at home too, where, you've got certain spots where, if a big buck's showing up in a certain spot and you can't get away with the wind and you need to be in there, about the only thing you can do is set up a blind, one of these hard shell blinds, which, we've been using Banks for a long time. So we had a Banks blind set up in there, went in there. I actually got there the morning of the 13th, went in early that day. We had a food plot that deer was hitting, and we had some standing soybeans also. And those deer
what
were
was
really
planted in the what was planted in the food plot, Adam?
I want to say that it was a pure traction. It was a mixture of a few different things, but it had some oats and some wintergreens and some different stuff in there. But the deer were kind of like hitting that on the way to the beans.
Gotcha.
The food plot to the beans. And man, right before prime time, bucks started funneling out. He was actually the 12th buck into the field that night, and I had never gotten pictures of that many deer in the plots in one evening. But it was, like I said, it was red moon, perfect wind. We had a good weather pattern. The rain had finally let up and cleared off. So I want to say we had high pressure that day. So like I said, perfect storm, everything lined up. And that buck came out. He was the 12th buck into the field. And I actually had to watch that deer for probably 10 minutes before I could get a clear shot, because he was either feeding facing me and I didn't have a clear shot, or I had other deer between me and him. And when I finally got my opportunity, I did everything I could have possibly done wrong. I'm filming myself in the Banks blind. I got my camera on a tripod. And, I've got 12 bucks within 30 yards of me, all directly downwind. And this blind is setting on the ground. It wasn't up elevated at all. So I know I've got all the windows closed. As soon as I crack that window open, it's probably going to be a matter of seconds before these deer have figured out what's going on. So I knew I was going to have to get it done quickly. I did take some precautionary steps though. Put a bunch of calming scent out in front of the blind from raw, and I had the ozonics going on inside the blind. So when I opened it up, I was hoping, obviously that stuff's going to kill all my scent in the blind is what I'm thinking. So I'm going to get a couple extra seconds, hopefully, before something knows the game's up. So I finally get my opportunity. I go to crack the window open and I'm not looking at it, and it hits the microphone on my camera and I can't get the window to go up. And as soon as it bumps the microphone, the buck standing next to the buck I'm after is like, on me. He knows something's up. So I've got to lower the window, more movement, move the microphone and camera out of the way, open the window up again, get the camera back on the deer. And fortunately, the buck that saw me is moving, but the buck that I'm wanting to kill was still standing there. And you'll see it on the show this year. I can't for the life of me get my
release
clipped on my loop. because it's getting to be, low light. Plus, I'm in a blind, so you can't see anything when it starts getting low light. 3 or 4 times, I couldn't find that loop to save my life. I finally ended up having to put my release up against the string and sliding it up the string until I could feel the loop, and just said a quick prayer and opened it up and clipped it, and I was on. And by this time, that buck is, they never smelled me because they didn't run, but he knew something was up because a couple of the other bucks were walking off. So he starts leaving. So I quickly got drawn back. The camera was on him and he was just about to leave frame, and I let it go. And as soon as I let it go and it hit him, I'm like, right through the guts. Ooh. Center punch the guts. Like, you've got to be kidding me. Actually went back that night and watched the footage, and he was actually angling away from me a little bit more than I thought. And that arrow ended up hitting back behind the ribs, but it angled right up through everything. And even though we let him lay until noon the next day, he was dead, within minutes. He didn't go 100 yards into the woods. But you talk about a testament for the MoonGuide. I mean, here's a mature buck, 180-inch deer that was not living on the farm. Had 2 daylight pictures of that buck all year long. We had multiple pictures of this deer, but the only time he showed up in daylight was right there at the red moon. 2 minutes left in the game, January 13th.
Yeah.
Everything finally came together on the red moon, and it just, saved my season. Went from just a shit show to shooting a giant at the last minute. And I'll tell you, there was a few times when I was ready to throw in the towel. I was so frustrated, but just kept after it. And I just kept thinking in the back of my mind, man, with that deer showing up on the red moon, once in October, once in November. December was kind of a wash with all the pressure from gun season, but I just had a feeling that red moon in January was going to be the ticket, and everything else lined up. It wasn't just the moon. Had to wait for the perfect wind, and we had some better weather, and we had the food there. So came together, and like I said, it really saved my season. And thank God for the moon.
Yeah. And the bank's blind and everything, man. It just, the no quit attitude, staying after it. A lot of guys would have gotten frustrated and just said, you know what, we'll get after it next year and move on. And, that seems to be pretty synonymous about guys that kill big bucks consistently, is the no quit attitude. Until the last song has played, they're going to keep hunting, keep hunting, keep hunting.
Yeah, I'll be the first to admit, I don't think I'm, a great hunter, but I'm the most persistent guy you ever meet.
Stay after it.
Yeah, you got to stay after it. You can't give up. And, seen so many guys that, they'll blow a shot at a deer, or their deer gets killed by another hunter, and you can just see it in their eyes. They're just deflated, and they've just given up. And I mean, you just never know, man. You never know that next day a deer might show up that you never seen before, biggest buck of your life, or, like this deer, showed up and, he wasn't living there. I mean, the odds were stacked against me from the get-go with this deer.
Yep.
But you just got to take what you're given and figure it out, and don't give up.
Yeah. My thing has always been, every day I don't kill one, or every hour I don't kill one, I'm that much closer to killing my next one.
Yeah.
That's the way I deal with it. As you well know, hunting out there at the tracks in Kansas, I mean, there's not many deer out there. You can go 3 or 4 days without seeing anything, and it can wear on you in a hurry. Yeah. And you just, every day that you hunt, you're that much closer to killing your next.
Yeah, my hat's off to you, because that tracks buck you killed, man. I think I hunted that deer for 3 years, and I never saw him on the hoof. He was a ghost.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, he got so old that I think I've talked about this with a couple other guys, is he just got comfortable in that area. And it seems like there are some deer when they get older, I don't know that they put their guard down per se, but they just, they become easier to kill. I mean, you look at Lee Lukoski talks about that, and I know he's a buddy of yours. He talks about that Gnarls Barkley buck he was impossible to kill until he was 8.5 or 9, however old he was. And then, man, he was hitting a food plot every afternoon.
Yeah.
And, just when they get to a certain age, something changes and they become, they get out of that nocturnal mess or moving further in daylight or whatever it is. But yeah, that was awesome to kill that deer.
Yeah, it's quite an animal, that's for sure.
All right, let's go to another one, Mr. Hayes, while we got you here. Tell us another a good puzzle piecing one you killed.
I'm going to kind of go back to what you were saying earlier about how some guys kind of struggle in November, when it comes to killing big specific animals. And, for a long time, I really struggled with November, because you just never know what these big deer are going to be doing in November and where they're going to be and what they're going to be chasing. And it's, if the rut was as simple as, the first week of November, they're going to be, running around crazy chasing does. And the second week, they're going to be locked up with a doe. And the third week, they're going to be breeding that doe. And then the fourth week, they're going to be cruising again. If it was that easy, guys would kill a lot more deer in November, specific deer, because you know exactly what they're going to do. But I mean, depending on the weather, when that stuff hits every year, it's like a crapshoot. Mm-hmm. Trying to figure out when are they chasing, when are they seeking, when are they locked down, when is all that stuff happening? And when you're trying to schedule, one's week of vacation for your best shot in November, how do you really do that? And it wasn't until I threw all that stuff out the window when it comes to trying to predict what phase of the rut they're going to be in, and just strictly focused on daylight activity, by the MoonGuide. When are deer going to be the most active? When I got my best chance of catching not only a mature buck on his feet, but the does too, because in November, it's all about the does. When are the does going to be most active? And paying attention to those peak activity times in November, it's a little different than early and late season because deer could be moving any time of the day. It's not your typical morning and evening hunts. And there's days in November where you might not want to be actually hunting your typical morning and evening spot. You might want to be sitting all day. If the moon is peaking midday, you need to adjust accordingly and maybe go in the morning and hunt until 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But, you got to adjust your location and where do you need to be, for an all-day sit. Or if that moon's peaking in the middle of the day, you don't want to be out on the edge of the food sources. You want to be back in the cover around those bedding areas. And I've found that in the last 10 years, I shot, I think, 3 booners in 3 or 4 years out there in November, focusing on those peak activity times. And I'm really not much of a morning guy at all, early and late season. But in November, it's all about time in the stand. And I've seen those big mature bucks seem to be the most active when you catch those peak activity times late morning. If it's daylight at 7 o'clock in the morning, anytime that moon's going to hit between daylight and maybe 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, it seems like that's when you can really catch those big ones making that final, movement or following that last doe into his bedding area. And I shot, we were talking about the gay 80 earlier. The 2 booners that I killed on that farm were both shot late morning, on an overhead moon, anywhere from 9 to 11, following does. Those bucks were locked on a doe. They weren't breeding yet, obviously, early November, but they were locked on a doe, following them and making mistakes late morning. And I've just found that to be, best case scenario is quit trying to figure out what phase of the rut is and key on peak activity. Deer have got to be moving during daylight for you to kill them. And when is that peak activity time going to hit during the daylight, and adjusting accordingly, for midday activity, being back in your bedding areas, being in those areas, those connecting areas, those funnels that connect bedding areas. How's a big buck going to check this doe group? And then how's he going to get to that next doe group to check them? or if he is locked on a doe, what funnels are they going to use to get into those areas? And killed some really big deer out of state during November following that tactic. And it's not, Bobby Worthy talks about, like you said, he talks about hunting those pinch points and funnels and sitting there and just, grinding it out till that big deer shows up. And, in November, that's really what it's all about.
Yeah. Tell us about that giant 8 or 9 point. I can't remember.
Giant 8 point that we had some history with. A couple guys hunted that deer before I got there and had some encounters with him, but nobody was able to, get an arrow in him. I had actually seen that buck the night before on the opposite end of the farm. He was up on the top of the farm moving, and I didn't have a stand location up on that top section of the farm. So my plan was going to be to slide into my morning spot the next morning and just trying to get an eyeball of where he was at and, where he came back into bed, and then make an adjustment for that next evening. And we had a red moon, overhead moon, a couple hours after daylight. And I want to say it was like within 3 or 4 minutes of that red moon, he come in behind me following a doe. And man, I'll never forget that sight. If I lived to be 100, I heard something behind me. It was getting to be that point in the morning where you're pretty sure everything's probably bedded down for the day.
Yeah.
When it was like 10 or 10:30. Heard something. I turned around and saw a big mature doe coming down the trail right towards me. And man, that giant tall rack coming right behind her. Just a sight I will never forget. And that doe actually come through. She jumped the fence.
Were you on that creek? On that creek where you come in right off the road?
I was halfway up the farm.
Okay, yeah.
Low creek, and then there was a big bench midway up the farm, and then it went even higher from there. There was like 3 sections to that farm, and I was right in the middle. There was one big tree that you could get in that kind of overlooked the whole farm. You could see high and low, and she was coming up that main trail. She jumped the fence, came right under my tree. I mean, I could have spit on her, and thought he was going to do the exact same thing. And he got to that fence crossing, and for some reason he didn't follow her, and he kind of did a loop around. And I thought he was going to get past me, and I had an opening like that to thread the needle, and ended up making that perfect shot on him and watched him run over that hill and die. And it was, like I said, I'll never forget seeing that deer coming through the woods, man.
All right, I know you got to go get your truck, but we got time for one more. So you got one more in your head that you can walk us through? That was a lot of strategy you had? Maybe one of your 200s?
I don't remember if we really talked about my first one, did we?
No, we hadn't talked about that one.
Very first one. Yeah, that was like a 3-year quest for that deer. I wasn't really chasing 200-inch deer. I think I killed that deer in 99. He just happened to be that big when I finally killed him after 3 seasons of chasing him. It was one of those deals where, I'd known about the buck. He'd been in the area a few years. I was pretty sure I found his core area. It was in this corner of this CRP field that I found in February or March that was just littered with big rubs. And it was kind of set up on this bend in this creek. And there was a wooded creek that ran the length of this CRP field. And he was just bedded in that CRP with the creek at his back. And I had gone in early season or early in the year and saw his old rub lines and scrape lines and all that, and kind of figured, if he was using that, what kind of wind direction would he need to come out into the field. And what it was he was kind of coming out of that CRP into the creek and then following the woods, which with a northwest wind, he could scent check that whole field. And then I could see where, the rub stopped, where he was kind of turning and coming out into the field. And that was really what I thought was his weak spot, was because, he's basically coming through that creek with the wind in his face. And then where he turns, And that's normal where you find those weak spots is in a turn in the buck's travel pattern where you can get within bow range while he's using the wind to his advantage. So I was just off of that. It set a stand early there. And the problem was, with the northwest wind blowing into there, if I walked the way I normally would have to access that stand, my scent would have been blowing back into that bedding area. So I made a big loop around to the opposite end of the farm, and I gave up the far end of that bedding area because my scent was blowing back into that bedding area. I gave up the far half of it so that I could get to that spot and not, tip him off,
Sure.
basically coming in from the other direction. And I got set up that night. Like I said, wind's coming from the field back in there. I love being set up, like I said, close to a bedding area, but not so close that you tip them off. Obviously, you don't want to bust them out of their bed. So I want to say I was within 150 yards of this bedding area where my stand was. And I had a big scrape right at the base of my tree. So right about sunset, and if I'm going to do some rattling, I like to rattle before I think bucks are up moving already, because I think you got a better chance of getting a deer to respond to your calling before he's already up and moving in a different direction. So I like to call to a buck that I think is just still in his bed. So he might not respond immediately, but at least when he's laying there, it gives him an idea that something's in his territory, and he's more apt to get up and come your way than trying to get him to turn if he's already heading in a different direction. So I did some light rattling about sunset. Didn't hear anything for a few minutes, another real light set. And when I rattle, all I want to do, and it doesn't want, I don't want to mimic two bucks trying to kill themselves. All I want to do is let him know that there's something there.
Yeah.
Like a couple immature bucks just, feeling each other out. He knows there's other deer there. He knows it's safe. And pretty soon I heard splash, splash, heard something cross the creek. And then I heard something else cross the creek down towards where that bedding area was. And I see this young buck trotting up the trail. He comes in, hits the scrape right underneath me, and I turn. You never forget the first 200-inch deer you see in the wild. It was just an unbelievable sight. And he comes walking down that trail, and he gets to that scrape underneath me, and he, pushes that young buck out of there. And man, it didn't even look real. It was so big, the biggest deer I've ever seen at that point. I don't even know how I got drawn back on that buck. I was shaking so bad, but I got an arrow in him. It was a little far back, and he jumped in the creek and started walking down the creek. And this creek went for, I don't even know how far that creek would have went, but I'm thinking to myself, I may never find that buck if he stays in that creek. And I still had plenty of daylight. So I give him about 20 minutes. Probably should have never done it, but I got down and I got in that creek, and I just knocked an arrow and started walking down through there real slow. I probably got 80 to 100 yards down the creek, and I come to a bend in the creek, and I can see just around the bend, I can see antlers sticking up.
Oh my gosh.
Bedded in the creek. So I went around that bend real slow, and I see him. As soon as I saw him, he saw me, and he stood up and turned my direction and started walking towards me. And I'm thinking, this deer is coming after me. He took 3 or 4 steps towards me, and then he kind of stumbled and went down. He couldn't make it any further. So I was able to walk up on him and, put another arrow in him and put him out of his misery. And just, I'll never forget that hunt. I mean, you talk about an exciting deal, just killing a deer of that caliber after hunting him for a few years. And then that whole ordeal in the creek and being that close to him and having him get up like that. I mean, that's
amazing.
Epic deal. If I could have had that on video, oh my gosh.
Now, where you knew where he was bedded, you knew kind of how he was moving through there. What was he going to? Was he going to like big cropland or big ag or food plot, or what was he going to?
So there was a CRP field, and then a really thin timbered creek, and then a soybean field.
Okay.
He was coming out into the soybeans.
So the classic food to bed. Food.
Yep.
or bed to food
And
afternoon.
I wanted to dive in there so bad when season opened, and that was the year I was really talking to Jeff about the Moon Guide, and he's like, "You don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. You got to go in there the first night and kill him the first night in because it's so tight in there." I would have never got in there and not killed him and got out without that deer knowing I was there.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you got to stay out of there until the red moon, stay out there until you got a good wind blowing back in there, so you know he's going to get up early and move. And yeah, just put everything together and killed the biggest buck of my life. And that's really where the whole thing started, with following the red moon and listening to Jeff. And man, can't thank him enough for what he taught me early on like that.
So I know we just got a couple more minutes. Moonstruck 2. This is one that you've written, right? This is a book that you've written from cover to cover. You want to tease anything up about that? When's it going to be ready?
Hoping to have it available this fall. We're going to have the original Moonstruck available in a couple months, probably July or August, and then hopefully this fall, mine volume 2 will be out. So it'll be either this fall or early next year. And
Gotcha.
it's really just taking things to that next step. You know, Jeff kind of lays the groundwork for the moon and hunting big deer. And this is kind of, you know, the advanced tactics, taking it the next step, you know, everything from, you know, the red moon to scouting, you know, the stories of most of my bigger deer and how they were killed, and how I've kind of taken what I've learned from him and, you know, developed my own system over the last 25 years, just like Bobby has, just like you have. You know, you find things that work, and through trial and error, you fine tune those things to where it's, you know, that's your system. Yeah. And that's really what this book is. It's just my system and what's worked for me. And I think a lot of guys take the time to read it. They might pick up on that one thing that might make the difference for them.
And that's it, man. Is, you know, we talked about this in episode 1 of this 3-part series, is checking your ego. And I mean, I had Bobby Worthington come look at a property that I have access to hunt just to see how he does things. You and I, you know, before the Columbus show, we walked that lease together. We talked about where the food was going to be, where you had your stands, where we could put a new stand, where we could move the food to see how you did it, to see how I would do it. Higgins talks about it, you know, guys that he talks to, you know, because he goes on all these consulting visits and he picks up things, you know, his rope scrape thing. And one example is, you know, he's got that 1-inch rope. Well, he goes to a client's house, and the guy's got like a 4-inch circumference hemp rope and the guy says, well, big deer like to rub big things, and every big buck on this property hits this rope. And so Higgins is going to start putting in 4-inch thick rope. So you constantly winning or
you
learning.
Can never stop learning, man. It's an endless pursuit for the knowledge.
That's it, is to, you know, get out there and get as much experience as you can yourself, and surround yourself with people that want to do the same thing you do and are really successful at it.
Absolutely.
Tell everybody how they find you, how they find the Moon Guide, real quick, and we'll sign off.
MoonGuide.com. You can email me at info@moonguide.com.
And then Adam Hayes on Instagram and Facebook, right?
Yep.
That's it, guys. All right. Thanks so much, buddy. Go get your truck, and we'll talk soon.
All right, guys. Thanks.
All right, buddy. We'll see you.